coordinate communication between the DECIDE and the GBADs projects. And they came up with a plan that we should run a joint seminar series. So this is the first of that series. And the intention is that we will hold a seminar roughly once a quarter and encourage the younger researchers in the DECIDE program and the GBADs program to present their findings and what they're doing. Today is going to be an opportunity for myself and for Gerdien to talk a little bit about the GBADs program in a sort of more general sense. And then Gerdien is going to talk a little bit about the DECIDE project. And I hope we will indicate where there's strong synergies and links with the two programs. And I encourage questions as we go through this. So I'm going to start. So I'm going to lead off, and then Gerdien is going to present the DECIDE project. So just bear with me as I open my screen. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Global Burden of Animal Disease program and its history. And I want to emphasize that there's a strong amount of linkage with what we're doing in this program with what Gerdien is leading with DECIDE, and I'll indicate that as I go through the presentation. I put my name on the front of this slide, but in reality, this program involves many, many people. I'm supported by a very dedicated and talented team in the University of Liverpool. We have partners across the world. Two partners are quite important here in Australia, in the University of Murdoch and also Sarah. Diane Mabry, I think, is online, and also Megan, who leads that team. I have a range of advisors for this program. We're funded currently by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Brook Foundation, and the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And I also want to sort of make mention as well to the DECIDE program, because Gerdien, Vilma, Johannes, Jamuna have all been very supportive in sort of maintaining the links in that sense. The program itself is co-led by the World Organization of Animal Health and the University of Liverpool. So our starting point is the range of animals that we keep around the world. And these obviously range in a different species grouping, but we tend to rely on cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Obviously, there's other poultry. And we're increasingly dependent on the aquaculture space. Some of it's farmed aquaculture, but we're also dependent on the fisheries that we actually are involved in. Why do we keep those animals? Well, we keep them for power. So we still have many parts of the world who are very dependent on draft power as a means of actually ploughing land or transport. Also, lots of animals are kept for the production of fibre and wool. And probably the principal reason they're kept is actually to produce food for us. But of course, we mustn't forget that these animals are a key source of investment and activity for millions, actually billions of people across the world. And they're an important part of our food systems. So that's the sort of positive side of what the livestock mean and why livestock diseases are actually important. But we're also faced with quite a number of very challenging situations with regards to these animals. Obviously, we have the threats of pandemics, the transfer of diseases from animals into humans. We also are challenged with how these animals interact with the environment. And there's lots of time and energy spent about how are we going to shape this? How are we going to change that in the future? And we also need to recognize that there is a growing concern that maybe we shouldn't be keeping animals at all, and we should actually be generating our protein sources in laboratories. And finally, these food systems are all impacted by war and conflicts, not just the conflict in Ukraine, but other parts of the world. So what's the answer to the kinds of situations that we face, the positives and the negatives? Well, if we look at The Guardian recently, Larry Elliott wrote that from health to climate, reliable data is crucial. And the underpinning of the Global Burden of Animal Disease program is that we do need better data on livestock and their disease problems and their health issues to actually make an understanding about what we need to do to actually support those animals. So in terms of the history of where the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme has come from, I've been involved in making a series of presentations and generating papers since the early 2010s. So that led to an OIE, a general session technical item in 2016, which was supported by Will Gilbert in the writing of that document. And OIE at the time generated a resolution about the need to think more carefully about the costs and benefits of animal diseases across the globe. And through that process, OIE and the University of Liverpool began the development of a partnership, which led to a concept note for a 10-year programme that was presented to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding. And we received an initial tranche of money in 2021, 2022, and we've recently heard we've got further support in 23. We've also had additional funding for rollout activities. So the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research is supporting a case study in Indonesia. The European Commission are supporting work in Europe. And obviously the Commission are supporting through their research funding the DECIDE programme. And we've also had support from the Fleming Fund and the Brook Foundation. And what motivates our programme at the moment is we believe that our livestock keepers, consumers and the environment need three core things. The first is we need better investment plans. So the current level of investment in the animal health systems across the world is probably not really adequate given the challenges we're facing. And we need better business cases that are based on true data. If we get money, where do we allocate it? Well, again, some of these questions are not particularly well answered, and we tend to chase the sparks out of the fire. So it usually is around the transboundary animal disease route, rather than thinking more carefully about the health and well-being of the animals we keep. And we need to generate data sets that actually allow us to evaluate our animal health investments in the past and start to understand where we're delivering the most impact in terms of societal outcomes. Currently, we're not very good at this. We're not very good at actually doing cost-benefit analysis ex post of any kind of investments, and therefore we can't actually say very much about our successes in that sense. So we started a process of going out and collecting data. Some of these pictures are taken in Ethiopia, which is one of our key resource points, but we've had lots and lots of Zoom meetings with our teams across the world. And to some extent with our PhD students, we're also collecting primary data, but most of our work is based on secondary data collection. And the kinds of questions we're trying to answer in that process is to think more carefully about the biomass of your livestock. Why is that important? Well, it's critical with regards to various things, both in terms of what investment we've got in those animals, but also in terms of their potential impact on the environment. We'd like to answer questions about the level of production loss in different sectors, how much is being spent in different parts of the animal health system, which diseases have the biggest impact on production, and how do our current animal health and disease problems actually impact on the wider economy and food supply? So these are the kinds of questions we're challenging ourselves with as we start to sift through some of the data that we've been sourcing. And we've done this by starting off really by establishing a conceptual framework, a systematic way of actually thinking about the burden of animal diseases to actually inform decision-making, to improve the equity of small-scale livestock and agricultural producers, particularly women, and thinking more carefully about how we improve the efficiency of the use of scarce natural resources in order to actually reduce the impact on farming on the environment in general. So our framework looks like this. It's modelled on the idea of the disability adjusted life years in human health, which looks quite a simple framework. And similarly, this looks quite simple in many respects. So we're taking livestock populations, we're thinking about their biomass and the inputs to that particular system, the value of the animals themselves and their outputs. We're then doing a gap analysis of with and without, what would happen if those animals didn't have any health issues or any disease issues, to estimate how much are we losing in terms of production, but also how much are we spending. Now, these two components are important with regards the economic relationship between the spend and the avoidance of loss in that particular situation. So we have that animal health loss envelope, which creates a boundary that we shouldn't go outside before we start to attribute by disease, health problems, or accidents, to think more carefully about the absolute burden due to diseases or health issues, and also the relative burden compared to other things in that particular situation. Now, these three first steps within our framework are very much centered on farm level burden issues, and they're focused on the data we can glean in terms of both disease issues, prices, and production of those animals themselves. And this is where we tend to stop in many situations when we do analysis of the economic impact of diseases. What we've added on through work with our colleagues in the US, Tom Marsh and Dustin Pendle, is we're starting to actually take this information from farm level and understand a little bit more carefully about the impact across the economy as a whole. How does GDP change? But also, who's actually impacted? Is it consumers? Is it producers? Or is it the value chain actors within the food system that are actually impacted in that work? And we want to ask various questions by putting the numbers against these different parts of the analysis. So if we understand how much money is actually invested in livestock populations, we therefore start to understand what our exposure to risk is. If we have an idea of the animal health loss envelope, which is a boundary, we can also start to explore the balance between expenditure and loss itself. And if we understand better about which diseases are causing problems and their scale of those problems, what's the current spend, we can start to understand which are the most problematic of the different types of health hazards that we face. And the final part, when we start thinking about that wider economy aspect, is does the current public and private expenditure balance really reflect societal needs? Now, these are questions that you perhaps argue we can answer to some extent, but we haven't yet put together a true framework like we're doing with the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme to actually sort of understand these issues in their entirety. The kind of flow of the analysis we're looking at here is this estimation of the biomass, the kilograms of animals we keep in different situations, converting that into an economic value. And currently our work is involving both the value of the animal themselves, but also the value of the output in terms of commercially tradable products, developing an understanding of that gap, the difference between production with the health issues we've got at the moment and without them, understanding what that does in terms of productivity in that particular system, and then using that information in partial equilibrium or general equilibrium models to have a better understanding of the impact across the wider economy itself. We also have a team dedicated to looking at human health, which is led by David Piggott in IHME and Breck in Ciansano, and they're examining how we link with the Global Burden of Human Disease Programme and the Foodborne Disease Programme from the WHO with regards to issues largely focused at this moment in terms of zoonoses, antimicrobial resistance, and also nutrition. So we have an aim to actually link this quite carefully with human health and the impacts into the human health space. Now, that's a very sort of high-level schematic overview. There obviously is a lot more detail in terms of what we're doing. So we need to split our livestock population into different species groupings. And within those species groupings, we also need to think carefully about the production systems in which those animals are kept. My colleague Yin Lee at CSIRO in Australia has been leading how we think carefully about this classification. And for each species grouping and production system, we're interested in the animal health loss envelope, defining or attributing the animal health loss envelope into three different groups: infectious diseases, non-infectious diseases, and external forces. And then using that information to actually think more carefully about that economy and trade impacts. We can only do this by actually collecting data, and the range of data we're actually looking at means we have to have an interdisciplinary project. So we're moving all the way from the populations of livestock and their production parameters, all the way down to supply and demand curves across the wider economy. We have to have a range of different analytical procedures, again, from population models when we're looking at biomass estimations, all the way through to value chain analysis, partial equilibrium, general equilibrium models for the wider economy. And this generates a range of information that our users will find helpful, all the way from farmers who probably don't know what their biomass actually is on their farms, even though they're being pressed to actually think more carefully about the environmental impact of those animals, all the way through to people managing quite complex food systems and having to think carefully about the impacts of diseases on food supply. Now, I've highlighted here, again, at a very high level, where I think the DECIDE program sort of fits across this picture of GBADs itself. So the University of Liverpool are actually currently working very hard with Wilma Steinfeld in terms of actually thinking about the economy impacts of disease in Work Package 4. The data part of the GBADs program cuts very nicely alongside the Work Package 1, which actually leads on data issues. And there are elements of what's happening in Work Package 2 and DECIDE with regards modelling work, which we haven't yet explored fully, but it's something I would like to actually do further as we move forward with both programs. And then finally, when we're thinking about presenting information, there's a great example of decision-making software that's being led by Work Package 3, and also understanding more carefully the social implications of the livestock system, the disease issues in Work Package 5. Now, I want to return back to the 3 points I mentioned earlier. So the 3 issues that I'm very strong in terms of actually thinking about how we improve things in the animal health system. We need advocacy leading to investment. There are many parts of the world that simply do not have very strong animal health systems. So we need to be in the business of providing data and information to build good business cases that will attract potential investors and maintain interest of our actual investors in the animal health system itself. Once we have that money, we shouldn't stay still. We need to think about how we allocate that money to actually improve the animal health system itself. So we need to improve the decision-making within the animal health system. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we need evaluation of what we're doing to actually improve recognition. So we need data sets that actually demonstrate the impact of the animal health system, both in a positive and a negative sense. Now, we're currently doing burden estimations at a global scale, but we're also working very strongly with country groupings and also sector groupings. A lot of our work at the moment is very much cross-sectional, and the cross-sectional work we're doing is helping us to understand and articulate the kind of methods and data flows that we require, and to understand a little bit more carefully whether we've got any misallocation of expenditure, whether we've got inefficient farm-level animal health technologies, and whether some of these issues then create problems with efficiency, equity, and the environment at an economy level. And obviously, if we have that information, we can indicate where investment and changes are required. So that's the kind of short-term aim with what we're doing at the moment. The longer-term aim is to have time series of burden changes in the same way that human health has developed over the last 30 years. And once we have time series burden changes, we can start to think more carefully about changes in policy in the animal health system in terms of education, research, legislation, mitigation interventions, and technology changes. This is something we can't do at the moment because we don't have the data structured in a way to actually allow that. How are we sharing this information? Well, we're developing prototype dashboards. These are only the final point of what we're calling a knowledge engine. So we're looking at global level burden estimations, thinking more carefully about key sectors, so poultry, pig, and cattle, and aquaculture sectors that are producing key commodities across the world, and country level estimation work. A summary of that information is allowing us to disaggregate things by species, by age groups, by sex groups. And if you're interested in having a look at the products we're developing, please go to our webpage. you'll find a link to both the work that's being led by Guelph and also one of our partner groupings, First Analytics, who are supporting us in terms of the interactive dashboards. Where are we initiating or doing work at the moment? We've got a pretty strong footprint across Europe. We're working closely with Animal Health Ireland and UCD. We have work ongoing in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands and Norway. And we're initiating bits of work in Spain, which I haven't indicated here. Our strongest case study at the moment is in Ethiopia, where we've been working now for approximately 2 years. And we're getting close to actually looking at country level burden estimations in cattle, small ruminants, and poultry. And we're aiming to have working equids and camels added to that list in the near future. We've recently initiated a study in Indonesia led by BRIN, the Indonesian research grouping, and also CSIRO led by Diane Mabry. And we're in discussions or working in the other countries marked in green. So Australia, Bangladesh, South Africa, and different parts of the Americas. Our aim with the work we're doing is bringing together data, which is going to be a major focus of what we do in the next, I hope, decade. Thinking carefully about the analytics to make sure we have analytics that are justified in terms of their technical performance and the resources we require, either human resources or financial resources, to develop a knowledge engine through different strategic alliances. And this knowledge engine actually combines data flows, and it also produces information I've described with regards to dashboards. And we're interested in presenting our animal disease burden in 3 different ways. So how is that burden impacting the efficiency of our food production, generally speaking? What kind of problems is that causing with regards to equity, both in terms of poor people, but also in terms of the gender relationships? And is there an impact on the environment itself? That information will help us think more carefully about investment, resource allocation and evaluation, and influence, again, the kind of data that's generated as a whole. I just want to finish by mentioning that this is a partnership. It's a partnership across the world with the World Organization of Animal Health and University of Liverpool leading, but obviously this is a guidance process and we're drawing on expertise and data sets from different parts of the world. And I also want to recognize, and I forgot to mention it earlier, that I'm learning all the time, and one of the people I'm learning most from is Gerdien, who I think is a great leader in the DECIDE project. And Gerdien, I'm going to stop my presentation and hand it over to you now. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll try to share my screen. Yeah, is it visible? Thanks, Jonathan, for the very nice introduction. I'm going to present the DECIDE project, a project that is looking at data-driven control and prioritization of endemic contagious animal diseases. I'm coordinating this great project and representing the DECIDE consortium in this talk. The DECIDE consortium exists of 19 partners in 11 different countries in Europe. It's a mix of universities, industry, small, medium enterprises, and NGOs. We started in July 1st, 2021, and the project will run for 5 years. Our goal in this project is to develop these data-driven decision support tools that will enable farmers, vets, animal health managers, or welfare managers to improve and control prevalent endemic contagious animal diseases based on a multidimensional burden of disease metric. And I'll explain what that means because it's quite a mouthful. This is a lot, you can imagine, and therefore we focused on on young and growing animals, piglets, broilers, calves, and also on an important aquaculture species, salmonids. And we said, well, the most impacting diseases for these young and growing animals are gastrointestinal and respiratory tract infections. and then several specific pathogens related to growth reduction and mortality in salmonids. So the focus of the DECIDE project is on endemic diseases that may spread, have the highest impact, lead directly or indirectly to antimicrobial usage, and negatively influence the value chain. In this project, we have several work packages, of course. Work package 3 is where the decision support tools have to be piloted, developed and piloted. So that is where it all comes together. It's led by SVA, Jenny Frosling, together with NVI, Norwegian Veterinary Institute. But before we start with developing tools, we want to know what the stakeholders, the farmers, the vets want. What are their needs? How do they make decisions? What kind of tools would they like to have? And that's work package 5, our social sciences work packages, led by Angela in the Technical University of Zurich and by Jasmeet in University of Nottingham. So that's where we know what farmers, vets want. And then we need the data for these data-driven tools. So we have a work package 1 on data science led by Rushton and Céline Favillon from University Ghent, Utrecht and Ausvet that have an inventarization of existing data, what new sensor data can be used, what is the data availability of multiple farms, flocks, can we combine them, what methods can we use to avoid GDPR issues, privacy issues, federated learning, federated access. That is the interest of work package 1. And then when we have the data, it needs to be modeled because we want early warning systems. We want to know when something is wrong in a group of animals. We want to know how the disease spreads and what the impact of this disease spread is, so that we can also rank control measures. If we can limit spread, that is beneficial for the impact. The work package 2 modeling is led by the University of Copenhagen and this Christensen and his group, and by Pauline Ezano from INRA. And then we have the data, we have the spread and early warning systems, and then comes the economic and welfare burden. It's the disease burden, and we call it a multidimensional burden of disease because it's not only the economic impact, but also the impact on animal welfare and the impact it has on medicine use. And based on this multidimensional burden of disease, we want to rank diseases, we want to help the farmers in choosing the right disease to manage. What control measures can they take? What is the impact of these control measures? What are the benefits? What are the costs? And all this has to be included in the decision to support tools. And this work package 4 is led by Wilma Steneveld from Utrecht University, together with Jonathan Rushton and Will Gilbert from the University of Liverpool. And the tasks in this work package are to determine the multidimensional burden of disease by also looking at loss and expenditure frontiers of the causes and risk factors of diseases. What are the current levels of allocations for disease control, and what are the additional costs and benefits of interventions? And then a very challenging one is, what is the relationship between health, diseases, and welfare? So how do we calculate welfare into the burden of animal diseases? And of course, all this is in very close collaboration with the GBADs program, because of a lot of the questions that we have are already also covered in the GBADs program. And Jonathan already showed this figure in which they will determine the biomass of livestock population, look at the animal health loss envelope, and then attribute diseases by health problems and accidents. And that is not much different from what we wanted to do in DECIDE, and that's also why we decided to closely collaborate. And what we want to do in DECIDE more than probably in GBADs is how we want to grow from global to farm level. For us, the farm level is important. We want to make farm level decisions. We want to support decisions with our multidimensional burden of disease. And but that's also where GBAD starts. So that is where we can closely collaborate. And then what we take it a step further in DECIDE is that we determine the impact of disease interventions. What are the costs and benefits of control options, vaccinations, preventive measures? What can the farmers do to reduce the disease burden? And also determine this multidimensional burden of disease. So include medicine use and welfare is extra in DECIDE on top of the GBADs program. We already started with looking at this impact of disease interventions and also a little bit in the multidimensional burden. And we first started with literature reviews. We are currently carrying out economic studies on porcine respiratory disease and looking at costs of intervention for bovine respiratory diseases. We're looking at modeling the benefits of interventions together with work package 2, the modelers from INRA, where they have developed several models for the pigs and cattle industries. And we're looking at observational studies on the association between disease production losses and welfare. There's currently a large observational study carried out by our partners in Barcelona, which will look in farms where they collect lots of sensor data and health data and diagnostic data, and will also collect welfare data to see what the relations are in this farm. So this is just a first result of a lit review that Marloes Boetes, the PhD student on this work package in DECIDE, has carried out. An overview of the number of eligible studies by disease and time of publication for porcine respiratory disease. So you can see there are several pathogens studied: PIRS, PCV2, APP, and there are also studies that look only at co-infections. The number of studies seems to increase across the years, but there's a large variation. And what we also found, there's a huge variation in the economic methods that they use. So, which also results in a huge variation sometimes in the results that they find. The bars are not box plots, they're just a minimum and maximum loss that they found in euros per fattening pigs that they found in the different studies. And the studies with the largest variation are the ones that did modeling, simulation modeling. And as you can see, there's much variation in the costs, also some variation between the different pathogens. And we need to think how we can translate this into helping farmers to support their decisions about controlling these diseases. And that's where DECIDE is based on. We need the data, economic data, disease data, maybe data on sensors to make it possible for early warning. That all needs to come together in a model, in a program. And then the decision support tool, it doesn't matter too much whether it's an app on a phone or a tablet or a computer. The users need to tell us what they want and what form they want the figures to be, what color they need the warnings to be. So far, it looks like they all want apps on mobile phones, but that is the first results. And eventually, we hope that we can help the users to make better decisions in controlling these endemic diseases. And that is not only a wish, we're also going to try that. And therefore, we have 4 data leaders. They're responsible for the development and piloting of the different decision support tools. So Jacques de Wit for poultry, Kim Segales for pigs, Bart Pardon for cattle, and Britt Bang-Jensen for salmonids are the ones that are responsible for each of these species, for the tools to be piloted, tested with farmers, evaluated, changed, and piloted again. So in the project, we hope in the end to have operational tools for all these species. So just as a conclusion, The DECIDE project tries to integrate science with practice. We have sound scientists in the project. We do collaborate with a lot of other projects and programs, and therefore, GBADs is a nice example where we can use their methods and ideas about the animal health loss envelope to translate to farm level in the DECIDE project. We want innovative tools for different users across different species, across different countries. And we think with the way we organize the project that we can get very far. And the results of the projects will also be useful, as they are from the GBADs program, in prioritization of diseases and control measures for policy makers and research agenda. The project will give you an idea what the most important diseases are and what the most effective control measures will be. Also on more national, regional, or global levels. So eventually we hope that we can better control endemic infectious diseases, which is an important pillar of sustainable animal production. I'd really like to thank all the people from these institutes here represented on the slide that do a great job in this DECIDE project. We are now 18 months in the project, and I'm utterly enjoying coordinating this. So go on with the good work, all the people that are in this webinar. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're scheduled for 7 more minutes, so I think we should have a quick round of questions if there are any.
So Gerdien, we've either created, oh no, there we go.
Arjan always has questions.
Happy to help you out. Jonathan, well, Gerdien, thank you for this interesting presentation. So one of the things I noticed on your slides, Jonathan, was that, well, this would shift the animal health more from curative to preventive. And of course, that's what we're aiming for and working for quite hard. One of the obstacles there is also that the model that veterinarians make money, at least in private practices, is very much focused still on curative care. And they find it very difficult to get that shifted to prevention. And if they do, well, it sticks to vaccinations, which of course also has something to sell in it. But it's very difficult for them to sell services. And of course, I see that in large part of the world where you have these big integrations that really have their veterinarians employed, it may be different. But do you see how do you see this work help in making this shift also in the earning model of veterinarians to get more from curative care to preventive care? Do you see any opportunities there that we don't see currently that would be provided by your work or Gerdien's work?
I think I'm probably the wrong person to answer that question because I'm not the one developing the decision-making tools. But
no, I just challenged you because you had written it on your slides.
Yeah, no, I would argue that it depends where you go in the world. But one of the things that we found so far in Ethiopia is the level of expenditure against the loss of production is totally imbalanced. So the animal health loss envelope calculations we've done to date indicate that expenditure is probably less than 1% of the animal health loss envelope versus a loss of production in terms of morbidity and mortality. So there's obviously a serious imbalance in terms of what people are facing with regards to technologies and preventive medicine that would actually help that process. So that will be one area at a sort of high policy level. I do believe if that information was available in a farm situation and people understood that actually spending some money to actually avoid losses could be expressed in a sort of succinct way, that would be a way to actually engage discussion and understanding of this. Now, people will challenge me on this, but I think that the truth is we have never yet actually presented these data properly back to farms and we don't understand the power of it yet in terms of actually sort of showing people what they're spending and what they're losing. So, you know, we can go and ask people what they want, but if we went back and asked people in the 1970s whether they wanted a mobile phone, they probably wouldn't have known what a mobile phone was. So I think some of the things we're going to be developing will actually be an eye-opener in terms of the impact issues. But Gerdien, do you want to just add anything? Because you're obviously overseeing the decision-making tools as well.
Yeah, that's my hopes as well, right? That by educating the farmers and showing them with numbers what benefits can be from preventive measures, that they can be a good discussion partner with their vets and convince them, well, we need to do this different, or I'm not going to use this antibiotics, but I'm trying to do preventive work instead so that I can avoid using this. And I do think that data and numbers are what is going to convince, is going to at least improve the discussion between the vet and the farmer what to do.
Yin, do you want to raise a question? And Diana, I'm sure we can
Yes.
keep talking about that at a later stage. Yin?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. I have a question for Gerdien. That is, you mentioned that your team is doing some observational study to analyze the impact of the disease. So my question is, I mean, it is common if you do disease diagnosis on the farm, it's commonly you can see more than one disease. In that situation, how would you, I mean, allocate the burden of the impact between diseases? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, that is often the case, right? That's why we have this porcine disease complex and the BRD, bovine respiratory disease complex. It's often a combination or a mix of pathogens that make it worse. Just one pathogen the animals can cope with, and then there's another one, and that's what makes it worse. So we clearly looking also at this disease complex. And sometimes then it's not so important. And what we are trying to find out is how important is it to exactly know what is in this complex, whether it's PRSV with PCV or whatever. Or that you can say, well, the control measures are not very different, except from vaccination, of course. But if you want to improve the climate of your stable, that will be beneficial for any respiratory tract infection. So that is a bit what we're trying to find out. How have we said in the DECIDE project, we're struggling in a way also when we thought about how are we going to do this with the level of clinical signs, just respiratory infections, gastrointestinal infections, and how much do you need to know from the causative pathogens. Sometimes that's very important, and sometimes it's not so important, especially when you talk about preventive measures like improving the stable climates or the stable setting. But indeed, that is something we are looking at a lot, and which we are struggling a bit to see how far can we go and how much diagnostics do we need.
Yeah, thank you.
So there was a comment from Theo Knight Jones from ILRI, basically saying that the work on animal health and elsewhere in the lower middle income countries looks to increase application of preventive medicine, which is currently extremely limited despite massive losses. So just confirming what I said earlier. If there are no further questions, Ayan, again, you're gonna.
Yeah, maybe just to dwell on a little bit on the point I raised and the point Gerdien was making. Just so a follow-up one. So can you maybe comment on the work that Marloes is doing, whether you think that there will be a bias in it regarding the preventive measures? Because I can imagine like that things like vaccines as a preventive measure is well, more or less much easier. It has a drive by pharmaceutical companies to be published. Whereas the biosecurity measures like you're mentioning, or the ventilation, so the climate situation, has a much poorer earning model behind it. So it would maybe be underrepresented in the literature. Is there something visible in the results so far regarding a potential bias there? I would be curious.
Yes, clearly. And Marloes can correct me when I'm wrong, because she's here in the meeting, I see. But yes, no, for example, there's lots of relatively much work on PRSV, and then often with related to vaccines, so interventions related to vaccination. And then, of course, you also have this positive bias in there, right? When the vaccine works well, it's published, and when it doesn't work, it's not published. So definitely, there's that huge bias. Although I do think if a disease would be much more impactful than another, you would see more of it in literature.
Yeah, no, I think so too. But probably there will be a focus on intervention measures that has that have incentives to multiple parties, and also, of course, the other thing is that vaccines are usually easier to implement because you give a shot and you're ready, whereas of course biosecurity requiring a 24/7 attention is also much more difficult. Thank you. And now I will shut up, Jonathan.
I just add as well, I think capturing the biosecurity investments is actually hard. So capturing vaccine costs and antibiotic costs is much easier than working out what the cost of biosecurity investments and training people to do things. So that's one of the challenges we face. But just going back to your point, Ian, without having the data organized, answering the questions you're raising is quite difficult. So we do need to be more systematic about how we're putting these data together. I think the results that Gerdien you showed with Marloes's study just indicate how variable the quality of economic research is going on in the background. And trying to standardize some of this process is actually quite an important step forward in terms of improving what we're looking at. Damona, I'm going to hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for your questions and also for your presentations. We're 4 minutes over time, so I think if there are no more further questions, then we'd close this first DECIDE and GBADs webinar, and thank you all for coming. The presentation will be available online afterwards. We've recorded it, so you can have this as a resource if you want to go back to it. And there'll be more webinars in the future, and we'll hopefully hear about it. So thank you, Gerdien, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
Thank you, Jamona and Mike.
Bye-bye.